The city glowed under the fading hues of dusk, its skyline a shimmering testament to progress. Gleaming research institutions stood like monuments of innovation, yet just beyond their shadow lay neighborhoods buzzing with life and whispers of simmering unrest. Beneath the surface of opportunity, racial divides quietly festered, unseen but deeply felt. Dr. Elijah Carter drove through the city streets, his heart still thrumming with exhilaration. Tonight had been a triumph. His groundbreaking presentation on clean energy solutions had earned him a prestigious grant, a recognition long overdue. The applause and handshakes from influential figures echoed in his mind, but what lingered most was the thought of the lives his research could change. The rhythmic hum of jazz filled the car, blending with the city's pulse. He smiled faintly, recalling his mother's voice from years ago, always reminding him to hold his head high, no matter what the world tried to tell him. He had done just that, breaking barriers as a black physicist in a field that often overlooked men who looked like him. But the warmth of his thoughts evaporated when flashing blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The sirens pierced the night, their urgency slicing through his peace. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled to the side of the road, the weight of countless similar stories pressing against his chest. Elijah took a steadying breath, forcing calm into his veins. He knew the drill: stay polite, stay composed, offer no reason for escalation. But there was always that gnawing uncertainty. Would it even matter? The officers approached, their faces hardened with suspicion. One circled the car, eyes scanning, for evidence of a crime that didn't exist. Elijah's professional attire and composed demeanor did nothing to soften their stance. He had seen this script play out before, and tonight was no different. Questions came sharp and curt, laced with assumptions that stung more than outright accusations. No matter how calmly he answered, their disbelief was palpable. It didn't take long for the situation to spiral beyond reason. One baseless accusation led to another until cold metal cuffs bit into his wrists. Humiliation surged through him as he stood by the side of the road, a distinguished scientist reduced to a spectacle. Passers-by glanced uneasily but kept moving, their silence heavy with complicity. The sting of injustice burned deep, threatening to unravel the composure he had fought so hard to maintain. As the officers led him toward the squad car, Elijah felt the weight of every indignity he had endured in silence. But tonight, something shifted. His mother's words echoed louder than the sirens. Your worth doesn't hinge on their judgment. A flicker of resilience ignited within him. They could cuff his wrists, but they couldn't shackle his dignity. And that was a battle he refused to lose. The patrol car moved through the city streets, its flashing lights bouncing off storefronts and dim alleys. Elijah sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists sore from the too tight cuffs. The bitter taste of disbelief mingled with humiliation. How had a triumphant evening celebrating his scientific achievements turned into this nightmare? Through the window, bystanders caught fleeting glimpses of him. Some averted their eyes, others stared with muted curiosity, their silence weighing heavily on Elijah's pride. He looked down at his trembling hands, clenching them into fists to steady himself. At the station, Officer Harris jerked the door open. "Out," Harris ordered brusquely. Elijah stepped out, his professional composure fraying. "Listen," Elijah began, his voice steady despite the thrum of frustration beneath it. "This is a mistake. I'm Dr. Elijah Carter, a physicist at—" Harris cut him off with a sneer. "Save it. Heard it all before. Some fancy title doesn't change the facts." "What facts?" Elijah demanded, keeping his voice measured. "You have no reason to detain me." Connolly, the older officer, cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Harris, maybe we should—" "We got this, Connolly," Harris snapped, his tone brooking no argument. Guys driving a car like that late at night, come on, you know the type. Elijah's jaw clenched. The type. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Harris leaned in closer, his voice low and mocking. You don't belong behind the wheel of that car. Admit it. Stolen, right? Elijah forced himself to breathe. No, it's mine. Bought and paid for, just like my degrees. Harris chuckled darkly. Sure. Bet you got a yacht, too. Despite the boiling anger in his chest, Elijah held his gaze. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Inside the station, the booking process was a blur of indignities. The cold press of fingerprint ink, the sterile flash of a camera capturing his mugshot. Each step stripped away another layer of his dignity. As Harris pushed Elijah toward a holding cell, Elijah whispered under his breath, "This doesn't define me." Harris smirked. "Keep telling yourself that, genius." The heavy cell door clanged shut behind him, echoing through the grim space. Elijah sank onto the metal bench, the cold seeping through his tailored slacks. The walls, streaked with graffiti and grime, closed in around him. Silence enveloped the room, broken only by the distant shuffle of footsteps. Left alone with his thoughts, memories surfaced unbidden. There was the elementary school teacher who had told him science wasn't for kids like him. The neighbor who had clutched her purse tighter when he walked by. The conference where colleagues had questioned whether his research was truly his own. Each memory was a scar, raw and unhealed. Yet they also fueled something deeper, a fire that refused to be extinguished. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. They will never take your mind from you. Lead with your brilliance. Elijah straightened his shoulders, reclaiming a fragment of his dignity. He wouldn't let them win. Meanwhile, across town, Sophia Adler sat at her cluttered desk, a steaming cup of coffee forgotten beside her. Her phone buzzed with a tip from a source who had recorded part of the arrest. She clicked the file, and the shaky footage played on her screen. Her brows furrowed as she watched the officers shove Elijah against his car, Harris's voice dripping with condescension. Sophia's jaw tightened. "Unbelievable," she muttered. She paused the video, her journalist instincts sharpening. A quick search revealed Elijah's impressive credentials. Recent headlines hailed him as a leading mind in clean energy research. The stark contrast between his arrest and his professional stature gnawed at her. Sophia's fingers flew across the keyboard as she began piecing together the story. The truth was there, buried beneath lies and prejudice. But she would find... Back at the station, Connolly approached Harris. "Think we went too far?" Harris scoffed. "Guy was asking for it. These types always do." Connolly frowned but said nothing. Years on the force had taught him the cost of speaking out. As dawn crept over the city, Sophia's investigation gained momentum. Inconsistencies in the police report surfaced, glaring and undeniable. She knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight, and somewhere in that grim cell, Elijah's resolve hardened. They could shackle his body, but they would never cage his brilliance. The city hummed with life as Sophia stared at her screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked the final button. The exposé was live. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She leaned back, her breath shallow, knowing the truth was now out in the world. Her phone vibrated violently, messages, emails, alerts lighting up the screen. "It's out," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. The article spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags demanding justice surged through timelines, igniting calls for action. Voices swelled, uniting in fury and solidarity. Sophia's phone continued buzzing. One message from Dr. Patel stood out. "Thank you. This means everything." Sophia exhaled, her jaw tightening. They were just getting started. At the police department, Reporters crowded the room, cameras flashing as the chief of police approached the podium. His brow glistened under the harsh lights. Flanked by Connolly and Harris, he cleared his throat. The room fell into tense silence. "We take these allegations very seriously," he began, his voice carefully measured. "An internal investigation is underway." Reporters erupted into chaos. Voices clamored for attention, firing relentless questions. Why wasn't this addressed sooner? Do you condone racial profiling in your department? The chief raised his hand for order. Officers Connolly and Harris have been placed on administrative leave pending a full review. Sophia stood at the back, her expression steely. Harris's usual smugness faltered under the media's glare. His jaw clenched, eyes darting as reporters pressed harder. Sophia caught his fleeting glance. There was no defiance now, only unease. Later, Elijah stood backstage, the low hum of the crowd filtering through the heavy curtains. His heart pounded. He adjusted his tie with trembling hands, doubt gnawing at his resolve. "You've got this." Sophia's voice cut through his thoughts, steady and reassuring. He turned, meeting her fierce gaze. "Thanks for everything," he said quietly. "You're the story, Elijah. Go tell it." Drawing a deep breath, he stepped onto the stage. The applause was thunderous, but it felt distant as he approached the podium. He gripped the edges tightly, steadying himself. "They saw my skin, not my mind." His voice was low but unwavering. "They saw a stereotype, not a scientist, but I refuse to be defined by their ignorance." The room fell into a hushed silence. "I stand before you as a man who was humiliated, doubted, and nearly broken, but I'm also a man who remembers his mother's words, that no one can take my brilliance from me." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "This isn't just about me. It's about every voice silenced by prejudice, every dream deferred by injustice. We must hold systems accountable. We must demand better for ourselves and for the generations that follow." Tears shimmered in the eyes of many. The weight of his words hung in the air. Applause began tentatively, swelling until the room erupted into a standing ovation. Sophia watched from the sidelines, pride warming her chest. Elijah had reclaimed his voice, and the world was listening. As the forum concluded, supporters surrounded Elijah, their voices filled with gratitude and shared stories of resilience. "You did it," Sophia said softly as she approached. Elijah's smile was wide, his eyes gleaming. "We did it." Hope sparked in the air, palpable and radiant. The fight was far from over, but a powerful step had been taken toward justice. And this was only the beginning. The city had changed, or maybe people had finally started seeing it for what it truly was. The police department, under immense pressure, announced sweeping reforms. Public officials stood grimly behind podiums promising accountability. Implicit bias training programs were rolled out. Stronger measures were put in place to hold officers accountable for misconduct. Some believed it was just for show, but for others it was a start. Sophia sat in her modest office, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The national accolades had poured in. Television appearances, speaking engagements, even a nomination for a prestigious journalism award. Yet none of it mattered as much as the quiet knowledge that truth had sparked change. Her phone buzzed. Elijah's name lit up the screen. "Still changing the world, I see." His voice teased, warm with sincerity. "Trying," she said with a laugh. "How about you? They've practically crowned you the king of STEM advocacy." "Well," he said with mock arrogance, "I am kind of a big deal now." They both laughed, the sound easy, free from the weight of their shared battle. Elijah's life had transformed. His experience fueled a passion that could no longer be contained within sterile laboratory walls. Conference after conference, he stood before packed audiences, advocating for diversity and equity in STEM. His voice was firm, powerful, no longer hesitant. He had become a mentor to young scientists of color, guiding them through a world that too often dismissed their brilliance. "Your brilliance is your shield," he would tell them, echoing his mother's wisdom. Never forget that. But despite the triumphs, there were scars, silent reminders of what he had endured. Late at night, when the world was quiet, those memories crept back. The humiliation, the doubt, the rage. Yet he wore those scars like armor now. One crisp afternoon, Sophia and Elijah met at a small cafe tucked away from the bustle of the city. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the hum of conversation. Sophia sipped her drink, her eyes thoughtful. "You look different," she remarked. "How so?" "Lighter," she said, "like you finally put down a weight you were carrying." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I have." There was a beat of silence before Elijah's voice softened. "Thank you, Sophia, for believing me when no one else would." She met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "The truth always matters, Elijah, and so do people like you." The moment hung between them, filled with unspoken gratitude and understanding. They parted ways with a renewed sense of purpose. Sophia returned to her work, knowing the fight for justice was never truly over. Elijah continued his mission, determined to make the path easier for those who would come after him. The city hadn't changed entirely. Prejudice still lingered, woven into the fabric of society. But hope had taken root, stubborn and fierce. Their journey had proven one undeniable truth. Change was possible when voices united against injustice. And in the face of adversity, courage, resilience, and truth would always light the way.